So it sounds like your first job with McAlpine was excellent, but you were pretty much a one-man band.
Yeah, I was pretty much a one-man band. We did get a second pilot, and then finally a third one, and I became chief pilot of this great enterprise. And it was fascinating, varied flying, but it was very hard work. I mean, in essence, you were potentially on call sort of 7 days a week. They were very good employers, and Kenneth McAlpine was my sort of ultimate boss, who was a splendid man. He was a Spitfire pilot at the tail end of the war.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and a very, very fine gentleman who's still alive and very much alive, and lives down in Lamberhurst, has vineyards.
Oh, lovely.
He became one of the sort of first Brits to start up vineyards in this country. Anyway, I just basically knew that really what I wanted to get into with the airlines, because I wanted to go long haul flying. And suddenly the airlines started advertising. I applied to Qantas, BEA and BOAC, British European Airways and British Overseas Airways.
Well, I thought it meant better on a camel.
Yeah, that's one of the interpretations.
Sorry.
And BEA pilots, by the way, in BOAC were always known as flat earthers because they never flew far enough to find out the earth was round. Since we're on this slightly facetious
Excellent.
theme.
No. But I'm going to take you back to McAlpines for a moment.
Oh, okay.
I was
well.
dismayed to discover that you took up helicopter flying and nearly became a cropper in a chopper. You must look back on choosing to fly those as one of your poorer decisions.
You as a fixed-wing pilot will totally understand that helicopters shouldn't be able to fly at all.
Not either, like the bumblebee, I'm sure.
Just like the bumblebee, yeah. Not quite sure what happened. I was coming into land in this field, and suddenly the helicopter, was a Hiller 12B, started spinning around. And the famous Hutchinson inertial platform toppled, and I now became a passenger in this thing. And by the way, it only had a lap strap, no shoulder harness.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And finally what happened was it beat itself to death on the ground. And it was jumping up and down like this, and I was being thrown around all over the place in the cockpit, unable to sort of zero in on anything. And its final death throw was to leap up, turn upside down, and crash down onto the main rotor. So that effectively killed it, which was good. So I'm now hanging suspended by this lap strap, upside down, and I could smell petrol dripping out. So I thought, it's time to get out of here. So I released the lap strap and landed on my head, and then sort of surveyed the scene. And there was a great big hole in the perspex bubble. And I climbed out of this hole, cutting the back of my hand on a jagged piece of perspex as I went out. And I went off about 200 yards away from the airplane in case it all blew up or something, and sat there rather disconsolate in this field. And I noticed that there was a tractor coming up towards me. And I thought, help is at hand. And this tractor came up, and this good old boy driving the tractor said, "You all right then? You all right then?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so. I just cut the back of my hand a bit, and I'm a bit shaken." He said, "Oh, good," he said. And he just went back to his tractor, went back to his field that he was ploughing, and he left me sitting there. I couldn't believe it. I thought he'd come to rescue me. And what happened was that one of the other helicopters from this outfit, it was God, I can't remember the name. It was based at Bourne near Cambridge. can't remember the name of the company, and one of their other helicopters flew over and saw me sitting there and came in and picked me up. And I went in to see the boss of this helicopter company and said, "Terribly sorry, boss, I've written off your helicopter." And he looked at me, he said, "Oh, have you really?" He said, "Oh, that's good." He said, "I've been trying to sell it for several years. It had been used for crop dusting, and I think it was all fairly rotten inside with sort of various chemicals and things that had been carried in it."
I gather the shaft of the tail rotor broke. That was the start of your troubles.
That was the start of the troubles. That's what caused me to spin around.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good old Newton. Sometimes he's not our best friend.
No.
Excellent. Now, I also remember you had a special trick for smuggling wine back from France. Very useful. Mixing it with smelly cheese, as I recall.
Oh, yes, yes. Smelly cheese definitely puts the customs people off. They reel away from it.
I must remember that.
When it's ripened nicely in a rather hot baggage compartment.
Excellent. Excellent. Oh, well, I love that. So let's take you under your life with a BOAC. It was on the 707 you started. My father always thought of it as a rather agricultural aircraft after he flew the VC-10. Did you enjoy flying it?
The 707 was not an airplane you could say was enjoyable to fly. No, it was clunky. You sent a message from the control column and eventually it would transmit itself to the ailerons or whatever and something would happen. But no, it was a sort of Ford motor car of the airline world, I suppose.
It suffered a bit from Dutch roll, as I recall.
It did. It had a definite tendency for Dutch rolling. So you had to watch out for that. But the thing that was a sort of complete shock to me, and this had never occurred to me, was that the first thing I had to do was learn to become a navigator. I had to do a flight navigator's course. And somewhere upstairs in one of our bedrooms, I've got a flight navigator's license, long since expired.
Oh,
I mean, I talk to pilots today, and they can't believe this.
Do you still have your sextant?
No, I do not have.
Could you still do a star shot?
I don't think I could. I don't think I could. So, the whole navigation of a 707 back then in 1966 was using periscopic sextants to take shots of the sun, the moon, the stars, and you had to identify the right star. Otherwise, you'd make a horrible mess of all the calculations. Console.
That was a
Loran,
tricky piece of kit,
and bearings from ADF bearings. These are all the sort of things that you were using. And the route that they used to use to train you to do this navigation was London to Bermuda.
That's a small target in a very big ocean.
Just think about that, exactly so.
Yeah.
And if you miss Bermuda, you're kind of stuffed. It concentrated the mind monumentally, I can tell you. It really did. And it was really hard work. I mean, I've done a 30-minute Astro air plot from Bermuda back to London, and you just don't stop.
Really?
The moment you do your periscopic sightings, you then use your sight reduction tables, get it all into a form you can plot as bearings on a chart, plot it all on the chart. That now becomes a position that you were at, maybe, perhaps, 6 or 7 minutes ago, and you then sort of project forward on the map, and then you're going through the whole routine all over again. It's seriously hard work. And one of my nav instructors, by the way, with whom I flew a lot, was Norman Tebbit.
Oh, wow.
later to become Lord Tebbit,
Mm,
who wrote the foreword for the book.
yes, and fine forward it was as well.
And a very fine man.
But he's quite a gentleman, I understand.
He's a wonderful gentleman. A wonderful, wonderful man. Yeah.
And what was he like as a navigator?
He seemed to be a very good navigation instructor. He seemed to think I was doing all right, so he was definitely a good instructor.
Excellent. Well, that sounds brilliant.
Anyway, so I can tell you that when I went on to the 747 eventually, to find myself in an aeroplane with an inertial navigation system and not having to think about navigation any longer was just the most enormous relief to me. I have to say, I never enjoyed navigation at all. Not that formal navigation. The responsibility was, quite considerable to keep that airplane on track.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Quite
Absolutely.
challenging.
Yeah, those of us who've flown with triple inertials and dual global positioning systems don't know how lucky we are.
No, absolutely right.
Excellent. So you had a rather troubled start to your career with BOAC with the distraction of Whiskey Echo, and then you subsequently crashed a Piper Aztec. Were you beginning to feel you were in the wrong job?
There was, I suppose, a sort of slight element of that. It's quite funny, actually. Whiskey Echo was, pretty traumatic experience. Although it's interesting. It wasn't traumatic while it was going on.
Perhaps you could tell the story.
It's only afterwards that it becomes traumatic and shock sets in. Well, in a very sort of brief terms, it was a 707 flight from London Heathrow to Zurich. In those days, all our Far Eastern flights used to go through a European destination before it went on any further.
Oh, really?
And the 3 European destinations were Frankfurt, Zurich or Rome. And this was Zurich. And that airplane eventually was going to go on to Australia. There was a route check taking place. So the flight deck was pretty crowded. There was the captain, a senior first officer, a route check captain, flight engineer, and me sitting at the back of the flight deck at the navigation station. It was a beautiful sunny day, gorgeous clear skies, beautiful spring day, perfect. And because we were only going to Zurich, we had a very light fuel load on board, and that's very significant. I mean, if it had been, say, a flight to Bermuda with a heavy fuel load on board, the whole story might have been very, very different. All I know is that here I am sitting at the navigation station, right at the back of the flight deck, and about 20 seconds after we'd got airborne, there was this big bang and a violent lurch. And I remember hearing the captain calling for a severe engine failure drill. In those days, there was a distinct severe engine failure drill as opposed to just doing a fire drill. Subsequent to Whiskey Echo, BOAC changed that, and for a severe engine failure, you automatically did a fire drill. But in those days, there was a specific severe engine failure drill which did not involve pulling the fire handles.
So were there no fire indications at that point?
I have no recollection of a fire warning light or fire bell. Not at all. My first appreciation that there was a fire was the route check captain sort of peering out through the side window back at the left wing, and he said something like, "Oh bother, the wing's on fire."
Oh God. That must have come as a bit of a shock
And
to
that
you.
came as a shock to all of us. And at that point, the captain ordered the fire drill to be done. And he was all set up, the captain who was flying, to do a full circuit back on 28 left as it was then. And the route check captain said, no, absolutely not. He said, you've got to get this airplane on the ground as soon as possible. He said, it'll never last, the wing will burn through, and we'll end up crashing into the middle of London if you go around for a full circuit. And the captain flying was very reluctant to do this. But it was eventually arm-locked into landing on 05, which doesn't exist now. It's a taxiway. That's a cross runway.
No, I've landed on 23 at Heathrow,
Yep.
but not on 05, and you're right, it doesn't exist anymore.
It doesn't exist anymore, and it had no ILS.
No instrument
No
approach at all.
Nothing at all. So here's the captain flying it. He's now been persuaded to land on 05 for reasons I've just stated. And I have to say, he did an absolutely superb piece of flying.
Excellent.
Judged the whole, eyeballed the whole thing down to an immaculate touchdown, which is an extremely difficult thing to do on a 707. Right at the beginning of the runway, because it was a short runway. It was only about 6,000 feet long, I think. And he safely brought it to a halt on the runway. What we, of course, had not appreciated was that during this short flight, I mean, it literally lasted about 3.5 minutes from takeoff to touchdown. And in that 3.5 minutes, the poor old senior first officer in the right-hand seat and the flight engineer were doing after takeoff checks, severe engine failure drills, fire drills, top of descent checks, field approach checks, landing checks. I mean, they were going like one-armed paper hangers.
They would have been.
They really were going balls out. But what we hadn't appreciated was that this plume of flame coming from the wing during that short flight had been impacting on the tail and superheating the tail fin area.
Wow.
And of course, as soon as we stopped on the runway and there was no airflow to cool the tail down, the tail just went poof.
Wow.
And the whole fire worked its way up from the tail of the airplane forwards up the passenger cabin. Now, we had about 120 passengers on board. There were only 2 exits that were usable. Everything on the left-hand side was just awash with burning fuel. The rear right-hand galley slide exit. The steward at the back there got out on that exit and went down, but then the fire got the slide and burnt it up.
Okay.
So that wasn't available. So the passengers all got out of that aeroplane, about 20 of them through the right-hand over wing exit. Most of them ended up with broken legs or broken ankles because they had to jump off the wing onto the concrete. But, you know, they lived. And the other 100 went down the slide. And I tell the full story about this crash on cruise ships when I go lecturing. Because I think it's so important for people to be aware of the fact that cabin crew are not there to serve coffee and tea and meals and pamper you. They're there when it all goes horribly wrong to get you out. And if you've got a well-trained cabin crew, your chances of survival are hugely, hugely enhanced. And this cabin crew were fantastic. They imposed their authority on the passengers. I think passengers were more frightened of the chief steward than they were of the smoke.
Excellent.
Dense black smoke and flames and explosions every now and then. A fuel tank would blow up or a tire would explode and the airplane would lurch one way and then lurch another way. And I remember standing in the forward galley area I didn't have to do a thing. I just watched all these people going off down the slide, one after the other. And eventually I realized that it was just me and the captain standing there in this. I don't know where the flight engineer had gone. I don't know where the senior first officer had gone or where the route check captain had gone, but they weren't there. There was just me and the captain. And we sort of shouted and yelled. And this dense black smoke, by the way, you can't see more than about that far in front of you.
And highly toxic.
And highly toxic. And the captain said to me, he said, look, he said, I think everybody's off. And as far as we could tell, everybody was off. And we retreated back onto the flight deck. And I remember shutting the door behind me to stop the smoke getting up into the... And then the captain went out over the out of this side window on the right-hand side and went down the rope, and I followed him. In fact, I was the last person off the aeroplane. And I can remember going down this sort of strop with smoke pouring out of my fingers. So my one and only injury was severe rope burns from going down this strop at high speed. And I was all quite calm at this stage. And what then happened was we went to the medical centre, and I can remember Alan Sibbald, who was the BOC doctor. He said, where do you live? And I said, oh, I live up near Stevenage. He said, oh, I live up in that part of the world. He said, I'll take you home. Yeah. And he was the sweetest man. He took me home, and as we got near to our house, he said, is there a pub nearby? And I said, yeah, there is actually, Alan, just up the road here. He said, well, I think we'll go in there and have a quick drink before I take you back to your wife. And he poured 2 double scotches into me. I turned up in this pub, absolutely black. I mean, I was black from all this soot and stuff in my uniform. I don't know what the people in the pub thought as this apparition appeared. And Alan Sibbald poured these 2 double scotches into me, which didn't even touch the sides, and then delivered me home. And I subsequently discovered he didn't live anywhere near me at all, bless him. He'd driven miles out of his way to do this.
A marvellous chap.
But what we didn't realise, and there's always, I suppose, humour even in the blackest things, we didn't realise that this number 2 engine had actually fallen off.
Oh.
And it had fallen off into a gravel pit. And there was it was Easter time, it was Easter holidays, and there was this father and his son at the gravel pit fishing, and suddenly there was this enormous splash, and they thought, goodness me, this is the biggest fish we've ever caught. And that was the engine going splash into the gravel pit.
Wow.
And I remember one of the tabloids had something along the lines, Captain Courageous jettisons flaming engine into gravel pit. As though there's a jettison handle up there on the flight deck. Oh, I'm fed up with this engine. I think I'll get rid of it. Pull the lever and off it goes. I mean, quite extraordinary. Right. And the tragedy of the whole thing was that, and again, we didn't realise this immediately at all, but we had lost 4 passengers, all at the tail end of the aeroplane, and one very, very brave stewardess called Barbara Harrison, who was awarded a posthumous George Cross for her courage. She could have jumped out of that rear exit. There wasn't a slide there, but she could have jumped out. And she didn't. She went back into the aeroplane and tried to get these 4 passengers out.